September 6, 1976, 10 minutes to 2 in the afternoon. Hakodate, northern Japan, a small civilian airport, one runway. A Boeing 727 is rolling for takeoff right on schedule. And then the passengers in the terminal hear it. A sound no airliner makes, a rising, tearing howl somewhere in the overcast. Out of the cloud, low over the bay, drops the most feared military aircraft on Earth. Gray, 64 feet of metal, twin tails. It cuts across the path of the departing 727, slams onto the runway far too fast with half the concrete already gone, streams its drag chute, and it is not enough. It runs off the end of the runway and plows 800 feet through the grass before it finally stops, just short of the perimeter fence. The canopy cracks open. The pilot stands up in the cockpit and fires 2 pistol shots into the air to keep the photographers back. For 9 years, the Pentagon has feared this airplane more than any machine the Soviet Union has ever built. In 9 years, no Western engineer has touched one. There is now one sitting in the grass of a commuter airport in an allied country, engines ticking as they cool, 30 seconds of fuel left in its tanks. Over the next 10 weeks, this aircraft will be taken apart down to the last bolt by men who have waited their entire careers to touch it. This is the story of what they found. And above all, of one thing they found, not the radar, not the engines, a detail you could find with your bare hand, in the dark. A weld seam, rough, uneven, laid down by a man with an arc welder, not by a machine. Hold on to that seam, because that seam is the honest answer to a question the United States had been asking and answering wrong for 9 years. And the wrong answer had already cost more money than any guess in the history of air combat. To understand the fear, start with what this aircraft was built to kill. In 1961, the United States was developing a bomber called the XB-70 Valkyrie, 3 times the speed of sound, above 70,000 feet, beyond the reach of any interceptor on Earth. Moscow's answer was to build the one machine that could get up there fast enough to stop it. A machine designed around a single flight profile. Climb like a missile, sprint in a straight line, fire from range, come home. The Americans canceled their bomber. The interceptor outlived its prey. The West got its first look in July 1967 at the Moscow Air Show, a formation of huge, flat, twin-tailed jets sweeping past the crowd. NATO gave it a code name, Foxbat. By then, it already held world records for speed and climb that nothing in the West could touch. Then it stopped being an air show act. In March 1971, Israeli radar picked up a target over the Sinai at 63,000 feet, moving at Mach 3.2. Phantom scrambled. Their missiles couldn't reach it. It crossed the peninsula, photographed whatever it wanted, and left. Then it came back and did it again. For 2 years, the fastest thing in the Middle East was Soviet, and nothing Israel or America owned could touch it. In Washington, the analysts did what analysts do. They worked from what they could see, and what they could see in blurred photographs was a wing, an enormous wing. In fighter design, a big wing usually means one thing: low wing loading, which means agility. So the assessment wrote itself. The Soviet Union had built a fighter with Mach 3 speed and dogfighter handling, a monster that could outrun everything and outturn everything. That assessment landed at exactly the moment the U.S. Air Force was deciding what its next fighter would be. The requirements were bent around beating the Foxbat. Mach 2.5, the biggest radar ever put in a fighter's nose, more thrust than weight. The result was the F-15 Eagle, the most expensive answer in the history of air combat, written to a question nobody in Washington had actually read. For 9 years, the only thing missing was the aircraft itself. The man who delivered it was 29 years old, and by every file the Soviet Air Defense Forces kept on him, he was a model officer. Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko flew the MiG-25 out of Sokolovka Air Base, near a village called Chuguyevka, 120 miles from the Pacific. On paper, an elite pilot in the elite service of the Soviet Union, flying its most secret aircraft. In practice, a concrete garrison in the Far East, cabbage in the mess hall, political lectures twice a week, and an apartment with no hot water. The distance between what he had been promised and what he could see out the window had been widening for years. He later said the lying was the thing. not the hardship, the lying. He spent months preparing quietly alone. He studied maps of Japan torn from a navigation atlas. He worked out fuel loads and radar gaps. He wrote out a note in English in case nobody at the other end understood him. It said, in effect, "Contact the Americans, hide the aircraft." On the morning of September 6, 1976, he walked to his jet for a routine training sortie. Full tanks, no weapons, the Sea of Japan ahead, 12:50 in the afternoon. Belenko lifts off as part of a training flight and takes up the assigned exercise over the sea. Minutes in, he eases away from the formation and dives. He levels off at 30 meters, 100 feet above the waves, under every radar on the Soviet coast, in an aircraft built to fly at 70,000 feet. Behind him, ground controllers watch his return flicker and vanish and log a probable crash. Search helicopters are in the air while he is still flying. Ahead of him is Japan and an arithmetic problem. The two engines behind his seat were built for sprinting at the edge of space, not for crawling through thick sea-level air. Down here, they drink fuel so fast the gauge behaves like a countdown timer. His plan is Chitose, a military base on Hokkaido. But the plan assumed altitude, and altitude means being seen. He crosses into Japanese airspace and climbs, deliberately, into radar coverage. He wants to be found. He wants an escort. The Japanese see the unknown contact. 2 F-4 Phantoms scramble north, and the weather takes the whole plan apart. Cloud from 2,000 feet to 20,000. The Phantoms are vectored again and again. They never see him. Radio calls go out on the international emergency frequency. His radio doesn't cover that frequency. The low fuel warning comes on. Chitose is 100 miles too far. He lets down through the overcast over what his map says is flat ground, breaks out under the cloud at 1,800 feet, and sees a runway. He doesn't know its name. There is no fuel left to be selective. You already know how the landing ends. Too fast, too long, 800 feet of grass, 2 pistol shots in the air. Standing on the wing of his aircraft, Victor Belenko asks the gathering Japanese officials for 2 things: political asylum and a tarpaulin. Cover the aircraft, get it under a roof. He assumes Soviet reconnaissance satellites are already being retasked to find out exactly what he has just given away. Moscow's first demand arrives within hours. The aircraft is the property of the Soviet Union, and it will be returned immediately, unexamined. The tone sharpens by the day. Airliners of the Soviet state airline develop sudden navigation problems near Japanese airspace. Fishing fleets drift closer to Hokkaido. Tokyo answers with procedure. There will, regrettably, have to be an investigation. The pilot did, after all, violate Japanese airspace. These things take time. Washington says very little in public. Privately, the U.S. Air Force's Foreign Technology Division, the unit that had spent a decade studying this aircraft through blurred photographs, is loading X-ray equipment onto a transport. 2.5 weeks after the landing, in the middle of the night, the Foxbat leaves Hakodate in pieces on a convoy of trucks down 60 miles of closed roads to Hayakuri Air Base. In a guarded hangar, Japanese and American engineers finally stand around the machine 9 years of Western defense policy had been built against. And on one of the first days, an engineer runs his hand along the underside of the wing root and stops. Weld beads, rough hand-laid arc welds, riding the skin of the fastest interceptor ever built. Nobody says much about it yet. Hold that thought. They knew what they expected to find. Mach 3 means heat, and heat means titanium. That was the SR-71's answer, at staggering cost. It would have transistor electronics, because by 1976 everything did. And thoroughbred engines, because the records don't lie. The first sample went to the bench. The report came back, nickel steel, not titanium, steel. Then they started weighing it, section by section, on aircraft scales. The numbers kept coming back wrong, and always wrong in the same direction. Empty, this aircraft weighs 20 tons. The F-15, the fighter America had built to beat it, weighs 12.7. The monster was 8 tons overweight, and every kilogram of the difference was about to rewrite 9 years of intelligence. Roughly 80% of the airframe was nickel steel alloy. Titanium showed up only where the heat is worst, the nose, the leading edges. The rest was steel plate, cut and welded, thousands of feet of seams, most of them laid by hand. In places out of the airflow, the rivet heads weren't even flush. On the fastest interceptor on Earth, the first reading in that hangar was the obvious one: crude, backward. A brute force copy of a modern aircraft. The second reading took longer, and it was the correct one. Titanium was scarce, brutally expensive, and miserable to work with. It demanded specialist mills and specialist welders the Soviet Union needed elsewhere. Steel was none of those things. Steel could be welded in any military repair depot from Minsk to Vladivostok by an ordinary welder, and it would hold. Conscript mechanics could maintain it. Existing factories could mass produce it. The crudeness wasn't a failure of engineering. It was the engineering. This aircraft was designed to be built by the industrial base the Soviet Union actually had, not the one the Pentagon assumed it must have. Which left the question that engineers still couldn't answer. If the airframe was this heavy, then what exactly was that giant wing for? Hold that one too. It's the whole story. They opened the radar bay and found the 1950s, vacuum tubes. Row after row of them, in the nose of the newest interceptor in the world. There was laughter in the hangar. For a while, then they measured what the thing could do. Peak output in the region of 0.5 megawatt, several times more raw power than any Western fighter radar of the day. It couldn't be jammed so much as bulldozed through jamming. It simply burned its way to the target. Ground crews back in the Soviet Union had a standing joke about it. Don't walk in front of the dish, it will cook a rabbit at 50 paces. And vacuum tubes have one property no transistor of that era could match. They shrug off the electromagnetic pulse of a nuclear detonation. The radar wasn't primitive by accident. It was built for a different war than the one American engineers were imagining. A war fought in a sky full of jamming and mushroom clouds, where delicate electronics die in the first second. The price of brute force was blindness. Pointed downward, the radar saw only the ground itself. Clutter, no targets. Anything flying low was invisible to it. This radar was built to stare up into thin, empty air at one kind of target. One job. The engines told the same story in a different language. The R-15 turbojets were not fighter engines at all by ancestry. The design traced back to a program for a disposable, high-altitude reconnaissance drone. An engine meant to fly briefly, brilliantly, and not for long. Service life was measured in hundreds of hours, not thousands. Fuel consumption was somewhere between extravagant and absurd. And past Mach 2.8, they stopped being entirely controllable. The compressors would over the speed and begin to destroy themselves. Power climbing on its own, throttles unable to pull it back. Which reframed the most famous number in the file. The Mach 3.2 runs over Sinai, real and measured correctly. What the radar plots didn't show was that those aircraft came home with their engines ruined. The flight manual's red line was Mach 2.83. The monster's legendary speed was the speed at which it ate itself. Now go back to the weld under the wing. Everything strange in that hangar connects through it. Steel is strong and cheap and heavy, 20 tons heavy, and to keep 20 tons flying at 80,000 feet, in air with almost nothing in it, you need one thing above everything else. Wing area, acres of it. Not for turning, for carrying. That was the answer. The enormous wing that American analysts had read as agility was a load-bearing structure. They had looked at a porter's back and scouted it like a boxer's stance. Belenko's debriefing filled in the numbers the hangar couldn't. With full tanks, the airframe was cleared for roughly 2G. An airliner in a stiff turn works harder than that. Sustained dogfighting was not in this aircraft's vocabulary and had never been meant to be. The MiG-25 was never supposed to see its enemy with human eyes. Ground control aims it, it runs in a straight line faster than anything alive, launches its missiles from 15 miles out, comes around in a turn measured in counties, and goes home to its welders. For 9 years, the Pentagon had scouted a drag racer as a boxer, and to beat that imaginary boxer, it had built the finest boxer in history. If engineering detective stories like this are your kind of thing, subscribe. This channel is a series of them. Because here is the uncomfortable part. The F-15 became the greatest air superiority fighter of its generation. More than 100 aerial victories and not one air-to-air defeat. And it exists in that form because Washington was wrong about a Soviet interceptor. The wrong question produced the right answer. That isn't a method. It's luck wearing a method's uniform. And the aircraft the world learned to laugh at after 1976? At its actual job, it never stopped working. Reconnaissance Foxbats kept crossing the Middle East above 70,000 feet into the 1980s. Tracked every time, touched never. And on the first night of Desert Storm, in January 1991, the only American aircraft lost in air-to-air combat in the entire war, an F-18 Hornet, was shot down by a MiG-25. 15 years after the teardown, the aircraft that wasn't real was still exacting a price. In Moscow, the accounting was brutal. The IFF system, the electronic handshake that tells every friendly radar and missile battery, "Don't shoot, I'm yours," had flown to Japan in Belenko's aircraft. It had to be replaced, not updated. Replaced across every aircraft, ship, and battery of the Soviet armed forces. Radar frequencies, intercept tactics, fuel figures, the entire flight envelope. Burned. The interceptor fleet itself went back through the factories and came out at the end of the 70s as a different aircraft. New radar that could finally look down, an infrared eye under the nose. Hundreds of aircraft rebuilt to unteach the world what one senior lieutenant had taught it in a single morning. Japan sent Moscow an invoice, $40,000 for freight and broken airport equipment. The aircraft went home on November 15th in crates. Soviet inspectors reported parts missing and billed Japan $10 million in damages. Nobody paid anybody. Victor Belenko spent months in debriefing and received American citizenship by an act of Congress. The story he retold for the rest of his life wasn't about radar. It was about a grocery store. On one of his first days in America, his handlers took him shopping, and he refused to believe the store was real. He was certain it had been staged for his benefit, the way model villages were staged for foreign visitors at home. No country, he reasoned, could feed people like this every day. He lived under another name, lectured to fighter pilots and intelligence officers, and died in Illinois in the autumn of 2023 at 76, having outlived the country he fled by 32 years. He never called the MiG-25 a bad aircraft. He was right not to. It was an honest machine built for exactly one job by a state that lied about nearly everything else, including in the end to itself. 1 year after the teardown, August 1977, a stripped-down Foxbat left a Soviet test range with test pilot Alexander Fedotov at the controls and climbed. It did not stop until 37,650 meters, 123,000 feet. That is a world altitude record for jet aircraft, and it has now stood for almost 50 years. The F-15 never came near it. Nothing has. The Pentagon was wrong about what this airplane was. But what it actually was, nobody has beaten yet. The bomber this aircraft was born to kill never met it. The XB-70 Valkyrie, the fastest bomber ever built, died at home, in peacetime, in 90 seconds. 5 aircraft flying in tight formation for a publicity photograph for an engine company's calendar. 2 men didn't come back. That story is next on Tech and Flow.